In inheritance, the base class constructor is called before the derived class constructor. Let's see this in action. So here in the widget class, I'm going to add a default constructor. Now let's implement this. Here I'm going to print a message and say widget constructed. Now let's include the IOStream header file. So on the top, include IOStream, and then using namespace std. Okay. Now let's go to our textbox class. So here we're asking the compiler to generate a default constructor. Now I'm going to remove the default keyword and generate the definition for this constructor so we can print a message when a textbox object is created. So let's generate the definition. And once again, we're going to print a message and say textbox constructed. Now again, we have to include the IOStream header file. So real quick, include IOStream, and then using namespace std. Now back to our main function. So here we're creating a textbox object. Now we don't need the rest of the code. Let's see what happens when we run this program. So look, first a widget was constructed and then the text box was constructed. So in inheritance, the base class constructor is called before the derived class constructor. Now let's take this to the next level and make it a little bit more complicated. So back to the widget class, let's add a parameter here, bool enabled. Now we need to make the same change in the implementation file. So our constructor is right here, bool enabled. Now here we can initialize the enabled attribute right here. Good. Now if we compile our program, we see a compilation error. Take a look. So we have a compilation error in textbox.cpp on this line. The error is saying constructor for textbox must explicitly initialize the base class widget, which does not have a default constructor. So let's click on this link. The error is happening on this line. So here's the constructor that takes a string parameter. The reason we get a compilation error is that as part of creating a textbox object, the textbox class doesn't know what value to pass to the constructor of the widget class. So you learn that the base class constructor is always called before the derived class constructor. Now, here we don't have a default constructor. We only have a single constructor that takes a Boolean. So when we create a textbox object, some value has to be passed to the base class constructor. Now, what can we do here? Well, the simplest solution is to add a default constructor here. So here we ask the compiler to generate a default constructor. Now, if you compile, the error goes away because in this case, the constructor of the text box that takes a string object will call the default constructor of the widget. Okay. But let's imagine that for some reason, we cannot have a default constructor here. So what are our options? Well, in the constructor of the textbox class, we have to pass a value to the constructor of the widget. So back over here, in the function header after the colon, here we can call the constructor of the base class and pass a value like true or false. And then we add a comma so we can have our member initializer list. But quite often, hard coding values like this is not a good idea. It would be better to add another parameter to this constructor, a Boolean. So we pass a value when we create a text box object. And over here, we can simply pass that value to the base class constructor. So here we can add a Boolean called enable. Now, whatever we pass here will simply delegate to the base class constructor. Now we should make the same change in our class declaration. So over here, we add bool enabled. Okay. Now we have the same problem with the other constructor. So in the default constructor, again, we need to pass a value to the base class constructor. So we can change the signature and introduce this parameter. And over here, we add the parameter and simply pass it to the base class constructor. Okay. Now let's imagine in this constructor, we don't want to do anything. This was purely for demonstration. So here we have a constructor that is purely there to pass some value to the base class constructor. Now, in real life applications, you might end up in a situation where you add several constructors to a derived class, and these constructors don't do anything. They're there just to pass some value up to the base class. In these situations, we can simplify our code by inheriting the constructors of the base class. So by default, the constructors are not inherited, but if you have constructors that don't do anything, they're there just to pass some value to the base class, we can inherit them. So I'm going to delete this constructor. This is unnecessary. Now back to our header file. We should delete it from here as well. Instead, we're going to inherit the constructors of the base class. And to do that, we type using widget : widget. So we're referencing the constructor of the base class. Okay. So this is all about constructors and inheritance.